Kwe tanse ulukut, good morning, bonjour. Kwe msitwen, wiliaksipuk. First, I want to acknowledge that this press conference is taking place on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Thank you for being here today. I'm joined by my colleagues Bill Blair, Carolyn Bennett, and Bernadette Jordan online. We're here today to speak to the disgraceful and alarming events that have unfolded in the last week in Nova Scotia regarding the fishery conflict and acts of violence perpetrated against the Mi'kmaq people. Every person in Canada, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, must be able to feel safe in their home communities and be able to earn a living to support their families. Under the Supreme Court's Marshall decision, the Mi'kmaq have a constitutionally protected right to fish in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. We will continue to uphold that right, and no act of violence will prevent Canada from upholding that right. To find a path forward for safe, productive, and sustainable fishery for all harvesters, we must be able to remain peaceful. The acts of violence we have seen in the past days and weeks are disgusting, unacceptable, and racist in nature. It is a disgrace to see these threats and acts of intimidation and violence take place in this country. We must also recognize that once again, as evidenced by the scenes of violence, Indigenous people have been let down by the police, those who are sworn to protect them. Throughout history, Indigenous peoples have experienced continuous discrimination, and to this day, still suffer the consequences of colonial practices. But they have shown an extreme resilience and courage in standing up for their rights. We still see this happening today in Nova Scotia, and it is a testament to who they are that they do so peacefully. In order to move forward, we need to have a proper, peaceful situation, and the protection of people on both sides has to prevail, and clearly that has not been the case up to now. Je suis profondément préoccupé par ce qui se produit en ce moment dans la région de Digby, et nous sommes tous extrêmement inquiets que cette violence puisse entraîner un appel au calme et de demeurer pacifique afin d'en arriver à une solution durable pour tous les pêcheurs. I'll now turn over to my colleague Bernadette Jordan, who can provide an update on the situation. Thank you.
Merci.
I believe you're on mute, Minister. Bernadette, you're on mute.
I apologize. Merci, Minister Miller. Hello, bonjour, Kwe. I'm joining my colleagues today from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional, unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm speaking to you today not only as the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, but as a Nova Scotian, and as a longtime member of a rural coastal fishing community. Right now, all of Canada is watching Nova Scotia. Many Canadians are learning for the first time about what an LFA is, or how the lobster fishery currently operates. But in Nova Scotia, in our coastal communities, these are part of our daily lives. They're part of our identity, because fishing is not just a livelihood, it's the way of life here. So when we say that the issues we're confronting right now are complex, long-standing, and deeply personal, it's the truth. What has occurred in the last week, the violence, the fires, the destruction of property, it's not the Nova Scotia I know and love. Minister Blair will speak more on these events, but I want to address today is the fishery itself. The Mi'kmaq have a right to fish, a Supreme Court affirmed treaty right. We're not here because we're debating that right. We're here because our country operated for centuries without considering First Nations rights. We built up whole systems, institutions, and structures without considering them. And right now we have a chance to change that for the benefit of every single one of us. Change and uncertainty can be challenging. I know that once we remove the criminals, the vandals, and the trolls, there are honest, hard-working fishers who are concerned, and that's who I want to speak to for a moment. Many of you have had a very challenging season this year. and you want to know that the stocks you depend upon for your livelihood will be protected. So let me say now very clearly that conservation underpins everything we do. Lobster stocks are healthy. DFO will continue to monitor stocks and will never move forward with a plan that threatens the health of this species. In May, our Prime Minister told Canadians to go out and support our fish harvesters by buying the local catch. We'll never stop supporting the hardworking women and men in the fishery. This is about First Nations earning a livelihoods on the water, the way their people have for thousands of years, and the way so many fish harvesters have for generations. Fishing is what should be bringing us together, not tearing us apart. What we have here is an opportunity to bridge the divisions in our communities, to have First Nations and commercial harvesters fishing alongside each other. This is achievable. This will strengthen our fishery. But to do that, we need to have space, time, and trust. We need to sit down with First Nations and do what we should have done 250 years ago. We need to review fishery plans and implement them together. So I ask that everyone give us the necessary space we need in order to have these discussions. We're building a more inclusive Canada and working towards a future that we can all be proud of. Thank you. Merci. Walalan.
Minister Blair.
Thank you all very much, and good morning, everyone. And I'd like to begin by joining in the acknowledgement offered by my colleague Mark Miller a few moments ago to the Algonquin people upon whose territories we are guests today. As elected officials, and I think for all orders of government, the most important job that we all have is to keep our communities and our citizens safe. And the violence, harassment, and intimidation that we have seen in Nova Scotia over the past few weeks are completely unacceptable. They cannot continue, and they must stop now. And because these criminal actions and violence, police in Nova Scotia has by necessity also escalated. And that means that more police resources are being deployed, both within Nova Scotia and from outside the province, to the theatre. Minister Fury, as the Provincial Justice Minister, and I spoke last week, and as a result of that conversation, he forwarded a request for additional resources for the Nova Scotia RCMP. That request was immediately approved, and that means that the Nova Scotia RCMP are now able to draw on RCMP resources from neighbouring provinces within the Atlantic bubble. And as of today, there are additional officers on the ground in Nova Scotia. The RCMP reports that they have deployed ground resources, resources on the water, liaison teams, and investigative resources required to maintain the peace and uphold the law at that location. Local detachment members in Southwest Nova are on the ground. People who live in the community are familiar with the community. A number of Indigenous officers who also are from the community and aware of the long history of this conflict are being supplemented by additional resources from Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. These officers are conducting supplemental uniform patrols to high-risk areas, maintaining a strong presence to maintain the peace. The officers have access to an RCMP vessel, and they're able to patrol on the water in areas where they are required. Additional water resources from across the division are on standby if required to be deployed, and I understand as well that the Canadian Coast Guard is maintaining a vessel in the St. Mary's Bay area. We have resources on scene to maintain the peace. Liaison teams from across Nova Scotia are working on the ground, and they are regularly engaged with both Indigenous and commercial fishers. Many of these team members are in fact Indigenous, as I've said. They are from the community, and they know the people involved. And they have been on scene from the outset in an effort to maintain a dialogue and a peaceful situation there. The RCMP has a significant presence in the Metawan area. They have deployed from Prince Edward Island officers as well who are specialized in training of de-escalation and crowd control. We know that these actions have become necessary to keep the Mi'kmaq people and all the people of Nova Scotia safe. The additional officers will maintain law and order. And they will make up special units to help support ongoing criminal investigations, and I'll provide you with a bit of an update of that shortly. But most importantly, we are prepared to hold to account any individual who has perpetuated the acts of violence and destruction that we have seen. Crimes will be investigated, and and individuals will be held to account for their actions. I've spoken this morning and over the weekend to the RCMP Commissioner, and she has assured me that she currently has the resources necessary to manage the situation on the ground and to I want all Canadians to know that we are taking these threats and the violence that has taken place very seriously. I know from experience that when such violence takes place, it can tear communities apart. And this is the worst possible outcome of any conflict. The suspicion, fear, and conflict can last within these communities for generations. And we do not want to see this happen in Nova Scotia or any place in Canada. The reckless violence and the racist threats that we have seen do nothing to bring us closer to a resolution. They only serve to divide us, to put our friends and our families and our communities in danger. And that is why the violence must come to an end now. It is the only way to give us all an opportunity to find a peaceful, lasting solution. In my conversations with the RCMP Commissioner, I have received assurances, and I am confident with the additional resources that have been deployed, we have the necessary means to enforce our laws, to keep the peace, and to protect public safety. I'd also like to provide you briefly with an update on some of the investigations that have been taking place. During last week, an assault occurred on Chief Michael Sack. An accused in that case has been arrested and is now before the courts. He has been released from custody with conditions to have no further contact with Chief Sack or the situation at that location. In addition, on October 13th, an arson occurred. A van was set afire. An individual responsible for that event at the New Edinburgh fish plant has been identified. The accused has now been arrested and is before the courts on that charge. In addition, the arson that took place in Atlantic Fisheries on the night of October 16th, this investigation is ongoing. A person of interest in this case went through surgery and will have a lengthy stay in hospital due to the level of injuries. The investigators are continuing their investigation to identify any possible second or other suspects in this matter. In addition, there was a mischief that occurred on October 13 at Atlantic Fisheries. We have obtained video of that, and we are now, the RCMP are working to identify those responsible. And in that regard, I want to ask for anyone who has video of these events, which could be used as evidence or to advance an investigation by the police, to please provide it to the RCMP. We have the resources in the community to conduct these investigations. Individuals who engage in criminal behavior of violence, intimidation, the destruction of property, or any other act which escalates this conflict will be held to account. And we ask for the public's assistance in these investigations, and we also ask for calm while the important discussions that are necessary and will bring this matter to an appropriate resolution take place. Thank you.
Thanks. Minister Bennett.
Merci, Madame Bennett.
Merci. Hello. Quay. Bonjour.
Merci.
Je vous parle de ma maison sur le territoire traditionnel de la Première Nation des Mississaugas of the Credit, où nous honorons tous les peuples autochtones qui ont pagaillé sur ces eaux et dont les mocassins ont parcouru ces terres. Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier toutes les communautés qui travaillent dur pour assurer la sécurité de leur population face à l'escalade de la violence. Tous les Canadiennes et Canadiens ont été horrifiés par la violence subie par les Mi'kmaq au cours des dernières semaines. Ils ont été agressés pour avoir exercé leurs droits. 21 years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed what the Mi'kmaq already knew, that they have a right to a moderate livelihood fishery. That was a long time ago. But it's not where the story starts. In 1760 to 61, the Crown signed peace and friendship treaties with the Mi'kmaq people, treaties that guaranteed hunting, fishing, and land use rights for the descendants of these communities. These treaties are the foundation of our relationship and remain in place today. Canada and all Canadians have a responsibility to ensure that these treaties are upheld and implemented. For millennia, Indigenous peoples have held conservation and sustainability as a core value. The Mi'kmaq nations have been working hard on their plans to exercise and implement their rights in a sustainable fishery. Canada is working with the Mi'kmaq Nation on their broader vision of self-determination, which begins with their treaty right to fish. Mi'kmaq have had this right, and they have the right to exercise it free from violence, threats, and racism. Ensuring we rebuild the nation-to-nation relationship is fundamental to building a stronger and fairer Canada. Over the last 5 years, we've taken concrete steps to advance reconciliation, support self-determination, and reconciliation, rebuilding trust is hard work. 21 years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed the right for the Mi'kmaq to fish. The failure to define moderate livelihood has maintained the uncertainty that leads to confusion and conflict. Over the weekend, we've had conversations with Chief Sack, as well as with the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs, where we reaffirmed our commitment to working in partnership with them to implement their treaty rights. We share their concerns for the safety of their communities. The violence is unacceptable, and the perpetrators will be brought to justice. As you heard, Minister Jordan knows in her heart how important the lobster fishery is to Nova Scotia and all those who call it home. The Mi'kmaq leadership is inspiring. I am confident that they will be able to find a path forward that affirms their rights, creates certainty so that the Mi'kmaq people are able to fish safely and free from violence. A timely and peaceful resolution will make Nova Scotia and Canada much, much stronger. Well, Owen.
Thank you. Nous allons maintenant répondre aux questions des journalistes.
Au Canada et à la Nouvelle-Écosse d'être plus vigoureux.
Journalist, one question, one follow-up. Nous commencerons par 2 questions par téléphone. We'll start by 2 questions from the phones. Operator, over to you.
Question au téléphone.
Thank you.
Merci.
Please press star 1 if you have a question. Veuillez appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. Our first question is from Christy Kurka from the Globe and Mail.
Christy
Please
Cook,
go ahead.
Globe and Mail.
Avez la parole.
Good morning. My question is for the Public Safety Minister. You mentioned the additional RCMP resources that have been deployed, but Chief Mike Sack has said that he doesn't welcome the RCMP and has in fact said that the military is needed to prevent commercial fishermen from, quote, taking the law into their own hands, and that the military is required to keep that peace. What do you say in response to that there is such mistrust in the RCMP that the Chief is calling for the military to be called in?
Well, first of all, this isn't a military operation. It is a peacekeeping operation, and it is the responsibility of the police of jurisdiction, and in this case, it's the responsibility of the RCMP. We have taken steps necessary to ensure that they have adequate resources to do the job. I appreciate the concern that Chief Sack expressed, because he, like we, share a great concern about the violence that was taking place. It was unacceptable, and it needs to stop. We have ensured that the appropriate resources, the right resources, with the right tools, are in place, not only to maintain the peace, but to undertake criminal investigations. That's a policing responsibility, to hold to account those individuals. One of the best ways, I think, to prevent further acts of criminality and violence is to ensure that people who engage in such conduct are held to account, that they face criminal charges, and that is the responsibility of the police. And I want to assure Chief Sacks, the Mi'kmaq people and all of the people of Nova Scotia that we are deploying the right resources to do the job of keeping the peace and upholding the law, and where crimes take place, to hold to account those who are responsible.
Christy, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. And just again on the RCMP, you mentioned the conversations that you've had with the RCMP commissioner. Over the course of the weekend, a spokesperson for the RCMP appeared on television and said, quote, "We don't see this as a police issue, but we understand both sides." I'm wondering what you make of those remarks. Is this in fact a police issue? And have you raised any concerns with the RCMP commissioner about the response that was in place from the RCMP last week and into the weekend?
I have discussed this with the commissioner, and we both agree. This is very much a police responsibility. The first responsibility of the police as the people that we task in our society on all of our behalf to maintain the peace is to uphold our laws and to prevent crime and to keep peace in that environment, in every environment. And so that is always the responsibility of the police. The police must be fair and impartial in the exercise of those duties, but when crimes are committed, when people are being victimized, when acts of intimidation that, they have a responsibility to act. And as I've provided information to you today, and as the RCMP commissioner has assured me, the police are in fact acting. They are investigating, they are laying charges for those who commit these acts, and they have deployed sufficient resources to maintain the peace and prevent these offenses. You know, when people do engage in acts of criminality, it is the responsibility to ensure that they are held to account and to uphold our laws. And that is that responsibility very clearly. I'm absolutely confident that the RCMP know their job. Perhaps, you know, if an individual officer misspoke in those circumstances, I want to assure Canadians that the RCMP know that they have a responsibility to maintain the peace. When crimes are committed, people are to be charged and held to account. Those investigations are ongoing. Those court cases will proceed.
Thanks, Christy. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ryan Tumulty from the National Post. Please go ahead, à vous la parole.
Yeah, Minister Blair, this question's for you, I guess. When the van was attacked and set ablaze, and the Indigenous fishermen were sort of surrounded on video, not responding in any visible way, are you concerned about that? Are you concerned about that was allowed to happen? And are you looking for any investigation into the officers' actions that evening?
We are, first of all, working hard to make sure that the RCMP have the resources they need to respond appropriately to conflicts that arise. In a protest situation, I have some understanding that can be challenging. I did witness, and I've reviewed a video, for example, in the assault that took place on Chief Sack on I believe it was the 13th of October. In that case, an RCMP officer did intervene, but unfortunately, the perpetrator of that assault moved back into the crowd, and the police were not able to make an arrest at that time, but they continued the work. They conducted an investigation. They identified the individual responsible for that assault, and they have laid that charge, and that matter is now before the court. And so it is not always possible to prevent every act of criminality, but people will be held to account, and we have now ensured that they have adequate resources to do all that is possible and necessary to maintain the peace in that environment. But people who would, we recognize that there are a certain amount of tension and concern within the community, but criminality can never be condoned. And this violence is completely unacceptable and has to stop. And so we've made sure that the police have the resources to do what they are able to do and what is necessary to maintain the peace. And if people engage in criminal acts, they are going to be held accountable. Frankly, we want the dialogue and the important work that Minister Jordan and my colleagues from Indigenous Services are currently undertaking. That's necessary, it's important, and it is the path to appropriate resolution of this conflict. But when people engage in acts of criminality, violence, and intimidation, it makes that dialogue far more difficult. And frankly, people will be held to account for those actions.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, the Supreme Court decision, in addition to suggesting that they had a right to a moderate livelihood, also in a follow-up decision said that there was a right for the federal government to regulate the fishery. How do you plan on balancing those two priorities what is a reasonable set of, I guess, of regulations for the fishery in your mind?
Well, I think
So
I'm going to pass it over to Bernadette quickly, but I think this is the exact fault line that we are discussing today. This is a right that exists. It is subject to regulation, and it has gone without being crystallized over the last 20 years. That doesn't mean, and I guess when I say this is cold comfort to the people that today feel terrorized by the events they've seen over the last week. But there have been advancements in advancing the martial right and Indigenous fisheries over the last 20 years. Obviously, again, cold comfort to what's going on and has been going on the last week, and the work that needs to be done precisely along that fault line of regulation. Each community has its distinct needs, and that adds to the complexity, but the complexity shouldn't be a barrier to moving forward. It doesn't make the job easy. The job is made even more painful given what has gone on, but that, and therein lies the nature and the tone of the discussions between specifically Minister Jordan and Chief Sack and his team, as well as the other communities and the Association of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs that is currently going on. We are pledged, and we have pledged to move forward on that basis, but no one should be under the impression that this will be an easy resolution. It is a nation-to-nation one that has to occur with respect, peace of mind behind closed doors. It is not something out of respect that we negotiate in the public domain, and people need to respect that. But as a nation-to-nation process, it is something that has to occur with the nation in question. And for that, I will leave the rest of the answer to Minister Jordan or Minister Bennett.
thank you, Minister Miller. With regards to the negotiations, right now they are ongoing with Sabaganagati Chief Sack. We've also engaged in conversations with the chiefs from the other bands in Nova Scotia. We had good conversations with them yesterday, Minister Miller, myself, and Minister Bennett. We do not, as Minister Miller said, negotiate in public. We are absolutely working on a path forward to make sure that the affirmed right that was upheld by the Supreme Court is implemented. To that end, we are also listening quite closely to commercial fishers with some of the concerns that they're having. We want to make sure that they're listened to as well. I think that is part of the process. But the actual negotiations is a nation-to-nation negotiation, and those are taking place right now with Chief Sack. And I'm not going to prejudge what comes out of those negotiations, but I think it's extremely important to know that we are on a path forward.
Thanks. We'll now take 2 questions from the room and then go back to the phones. Mike, would you like to go ahead?
Bonjour, Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Monsieur Miller.
Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada. Mr. Miller, a question. Do you have the intention of clarifying what moderate livelihood means? This seems to be an issue. Can it be quantified, for example, with a lobster quota? Answer, Minister Miller. This has been defined. It was defined 20 years ago with the Marshall decision, which defined the right to subsistence moderate livelihood. And in Treaty 700, Indigenous peoples from the Maritimes had to go before the Supreme Court to obtain a definition of what moderate livelihood means. And this week we are discussing this again. What is this right? This right is being violated by some commercial fishers and are even called into question. So what is moderate livelihood? And this has also been an issue in the forestry industry and in other sectors. It's a very complex issue, and it varies between communities. And it's not for Ottawa to dictate from above everything about this right. This right must be negotiated and discussed with Mi'kmaq people. We have tried to discuss. Obviously, there's more discussion that needs to take place, and it must be discussed with the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia. And these negotiations and discussions must be very respectful, very peaceful, and will not be done in public. So I can't give you a precise definition or a specific quantity or quota. Minister Jordan can also answer your question. We are in discussions with Chief Sack and with his people. Yesterday, we had a discussion with the Association of Mi'kmaq Chiefs of Nova Scotia, and they told us about the pain that they're experiencing with all of this unacceptable violence. This is affecting all communities which send their children to these communities to study. There's so much violence, it is affecting Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And the impact of this violence is huge, and we can't forget that. The discussions and the negotiations will continue. We will not stop negotiating because of violence. And I repeat, the discussions will be peaceful, respectful, and private. And Minister Jordan might want to speak to these negotiations.
As I had indicated, we have been having good, positive conversations with Sabaganagati, with Chief Sack. We are moving forward on the making sure that moderate livelihood is implemented. They have a very good fishing plan that we have been able to work with a number of the recommendations that they're bringing forward. We do see a path forward with this, recognizing that conservation has to be the underpinning issue that many people are concerned about. I want to stress again that that is always going to be the key priority that DFO holds, is that we want to make sure that we conserve this species for generations to come. It has to be sustainable, but it has to be peaceful. And with regards to that, one of the things we are also doing, Minister Bennett and I right now, are finalizing the plans to bring in a ministerial representative who will be able to, foster conversations and discussions between First Nations and commercial harvesters so that all sides are heard. But the negotiations that we are having right now with Chief Sack are on a nation-to-nation basis, and they will continue to be so.
Monsieur Miller, en suivi.
Follow-up question. Mr. Miller, earlier you said that police officers have abandoned Indigenous fish harvesters in this situation. How do you figure?
This could be the definition of terrorism, what happened this weekend.
Dis que moi,
Some police officers might have gotten carried away, but we don't have all information necessary about the riots and about the level of threat. So a full investigation is necessary. We've seen since the beginning of the issues and a lot of unrest among Indigenous peoples regarding their rights, and police must uphold these rights and must protect them. Police reform seems necessary, and especially reform of Indigenous police services, because Indigenous peoples feel left behind, and sometimes they're even very afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them. And that's unacceptable, especially in a country like ours. Indigenous peoples truly feel threatened by police. What we witnessed, and there's a video of last week, is an officer who was not able to do his job properly. And we will ensure that this does not reoccur. We will ensure safety on land and on sea.
Yeah, and if I just may speak to the last part of your question, what we have very clearly seen is acts of criminality, that crimes are being committed. And when crimes are committed in this country, the police have a responsibility to conduct investigations, to gather the evidence, and to bring those perpetrators of those crimes before the court. Are taking place. They have resulted in charges. They are continuing. We have resources there to do those investigations, and for the crimes that are being committed, people will be held to account. And those the charges that are laid are based on the evidence. that is collected. We're very fortunate in these circumstances, difficult as the conflict has been, but there's a lot of video evidence and a lot of people coming forward that are providing the police with information that advances their investigations. That work will continue, and people will be held to account for their actions.
Merci, Louis.
Thank you, Louis.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Ministers. Olivia Stepanovich, CBC News. I want to pick up on something Minister Miller just said a moment ago, that the police are failing the Mi'kmaq. Do you agree with that, Minister Blair?
What I can say absolutely is that the police have a responsibility to protect all Canadians and certainly to acknowledge, recognize, and uphold Indigenous rights. I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a need for significant reform in respect to how police perform their services in Indigenous communities. We are working now, and they're in the co-production of a new legislative framework for Indigenous policing right across this country to, first of all, to acknowledge it as an essential service, but also to ensure that it is responsive and respectful of Indigenous communities and Indigenous rights. And so we're absolutely committed to doing that work. I do acknowledge that there are concerns within Indigenous communities. We've heard those concerns, and we're working hard to resolve them. And as well, the responsibility. I've already mentioned that of the officers, the RCMP officers deployed on scene, they are also members of that community. Many of them are Indigenous. They live and have grown up and worked in the communities that they serve. And I think that's important, that cultural competency and understanding of not just long history, but the cultural concerns and the very legitimate concerns of Indigenous people on how the police serve and protect them and uphold and respect Indigenous rights is critical to that work. And so we're absolutely committed to doing that. I believe that the vast majority of officers do their very best to serve those communities with professionalism and with integrity and with respect. But clearly there are concerns within the communities that we're working hard to address.
And Minister Jordan, the Nova Scotia government is asking your government to define what a moderate livelihood is once and for all. Will you move forward to do this and not just deal with each community on a band-by-band basis? Will you produce a definition? And also, does your government accept responsibility that by not defining what a moderate livelihood is, that has led to this current conflict?
So first of all, with regards to the definition of a moderate livelihood, I don't think any First Nation wants the federal government to have a top-down approach. This is actually something that has to be done at the negotiating table. That is where we are right now. That is what we are doing. We cannot, as a government, tell First Nations what a moderate livelihood is. That is up to them to work with us to define. So, and with regards to the acts of violence that are happening, there is no excuse for those acts of violence. There is no excuse for the threats, the intimidation, the destruction of property. There is no reason why these things should be happening. This needs to stop so that we can continue to move forward with a peaceful, sustainable solution.
Thanks, Olivia. Nous allons maintenant prendre 2 autres questions par téléphone. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Notre prochaine question est de Hélène Buzetti du Devoir. À vous la
Question, Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir.
My question is for Minister Bernadette. I'd like to know, you keep mentioning that there's a right to fish for the Mi'kmaq, but is there a right to fish outside the regular fishing season?
These are all conversations that we're having during the negotiation process. Everything is on the table with regards to how we implement this right. This is a Supreme Court that affirmed that decision 21 years ago, that they're able to implement it. They have provided us with fishing plans that we are currently going through with them. We are making good progress. We are having positive conversations, and we will see this through to make sure that we address this issue that has been ongoing for many, many years.
But with due respect, you haven't answered the question. Do they have a right, from your perspective, to fish outside the season? And I would also like to build on my previous colleague question. What share of responsibility does the federal government have in this conflict by not going there? Like you're here in Toronto or Ottawa, most of you. What share of responsibility do you have in letting this situation rot to this point?
With regards to the ongoing discussions that we're having right now with the Mi'kmaq, those are negotiations that are happening nation to nation. Those are negotiations that are happening outside of the public domain, which is where they have to be. They are we're working towards a solution with them to make sure that they implement the treaty right that was that was affirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada under the Marshall decision. With regards to where I am, as many people know, I was in Ottawa and now I am home in self-isolation, respecting the Nova Scotia public health guidelines. But I have still continued to meet with our First Nations, with commercial harvesters. I don't think it's extremely how we meet, I don't think is as important as that we do meet, and those are discussions that we are continuing to have.
Merci, Hélène. Prochaine question.
Thank you, Hélène. Next question.
Thank you, merci. Notre prochaine question est de Olivier Lefebvre de Radio.
Next question. Olivier Lefebvre, Radio-Canada. Hello. Thank you for taking my question. My question is for Minister Miller or Minister Jordan. I'll ask my question in French. The commercial fishing industry, non-Indigenous commercial fishers, will they, at the end of the day, have to make compromises? For example, will they have to modify their fishing practices?
Having right now are there so that we can we will make sure that commercial harvesters have expressed concerns that they have. We are listening to the commercial harvesters. The number one thing that they are saying is, of course, the concern around conservation. I will tell you right now that we will always have conservation as the underpinning issue that we will deal with in terms of these negotiations. We need to make sure that the stocks are healthy. DFO will continue to do the science. We are seeing right now, we do have a very healthy stock, and we're going to continue to make sure that that is the case.
Est-ce que vous avez une question?
Do you have a follow-up question? Yes. Follow-up question. I believe that there will be more fishermen harvesting the same resource. So, will commercial fishermen have to fish less?
Right now, we have an effort-based fishery. We will continue to have that. Right now, the license holders are license holders. We've always been in the belief that we have to have a fishery that is based on that effort. We will continue to do that. We want to make sure that, as I said, that the conservation is still the number one issue. That is something that we've heard about from right across the board, from First Nations as well as from commercial harvesters, and making sure that we conserve the species for the long term is what our goal is and what we will continue to do.
Merci. We'll now take two more questions from the room. Would you like to go ahead?
Abigail Beeman, Global News. Hi, Minister Blair. Earlier, you spoke about resources on the water. I heard you mention both the RCMP and the Coast Guard. Yesterday, Chief Sack said no one was on the water, and they've been repeatedly getting the runaround about whose jurisdiction it is. Has that been sorted out?
Yeah, I've been assured in my conversations with the RCMP commissioner that they have vessels to patrol on the water and are able to do that. They're also working with Canadian Coast Guard. Obviously, they are on scene as well. It's a vast area to patrol, but the police and the Coast Guard both have a capacity to respond as required in that location.
And Minister Jordan, I heard you say earlier that you're looking for time and space in this situation. This is not a conflict that developed overnight. For weeks, you've been declining interview requests. We've seen you on Twitter. I'm not sure where else. So with respect, Minister Jordan, where have you been?
Actually, I've been actively engaged with First Nations on this issue. I've been actively engaged with commercial harvesters on this issue. I have been, working extremely diligently to come up with a solution for this very difficult issue that we're dealing with. This is something that is long-standing. It's not something that's going to be solved overnight. There have been a number of conversations over months with the people involved in this, and as I said, we don't negotiate in public, and I will not do that. This is something that has to be done with First Nations at the table and with commercial harvesters, hearing what their concerns are.
Thank you. Would you like to go ahead?
Ian Wood, CTV News. Minister Jordan, you've said that moderate livelihood is still something that's being negotiated with the First Nations. At the same time, you've said conservation is a priority with regard to the fishery for the commercial fishers. With those two things sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum, DFO, does it not have any numbers, quotas, expectations? Surely you must have a sense of what a moderate livelihood means based on the science behind the fishery.
I'm glad actually that you brought up the science behind the fishery, because that is something that will drive all of our decisions, making sure that the stock is sustainable. We are very much engaged with the First Nations community to determine what their moderate livelihood is. This is not going to increase any effort within the fishery. We are not looking at implementing quotas within the fishery. This is not going to impact the commercial harvesters with regards to a quota-based system, as some people have suggested. There is absolutely no intention of changing the quota, what we do have right now, which is an effort-based fishery.
And Ministers Miller and Bennett, if you want to add into this one, I'm just wondering, you've all talked a lot about how we are in negotiations now to determine how this can move forward in a safe and peaceful way that benefits all parties involved. It's not. Why wasn't this done sooner? Why wasn't this done before boats got on the water, before lobster traps were set down in the ocean? Why are we talking about this now that we're into the fishing season?
Thank you, Ian. I just want to clarify a bit the context in which we all are with respect to the commercial fishery. The Indigenous fisheries industry is an infinitely small portion of the commercial fisheries in Canada. It's very important for people to get that, because the picture or portrait that's being painted is one of Indigenous fishers taking all the lobsters. That is absolutely not the case. If you look at any of the number of traps dropped, it is a tiny, tiny proportion. And it goes to the earlier question that was posed by one of your colleagues from Radio Canada. It is a tiny portion of the industry. Certainly there's an argument, and the Supreme Court said it, that it needs to be regulated. But people need to understand, when painting this portrait, it looks like grossly disproportionate as to what Indigenous fishers are fishing and have the right to fish, that it is and remains a tiny portion of the industry. There's a lot of money to be made here, and we can't forget that. The lobster industry is a very, very lucrative industry. Commercial fishermen invested a lot of capital in that. And so there is an argument on that end. I'm the Indigenous Services Minister. Carolyn Bennett is the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister. So we are rightly focused on, one, the violence perpetrated against Indigenous peoples at this time. But when you look at the industry at large, the Indigenous fisheries industry is a very small portion of it. It has grown since the beginning of the Marshall case. So to suggest nothing has been done is wrong. It's just historically inaccurate. Yet there is still a fault line in the fault lines that we are seeing today, and violence can escalate quickly. That is sort of the situation that we find ourselves in. And I can certainly pass it over to Minister Bennett to talk about some of the work that they've done in moving that right forward. But it is a difficult, complex issue. It doesn't prevent us from moving forward, and in a quick fashion, given the state of tension in Nova Scotia. Oui, mais je voulais passer la parole à Louis.
And Louis, I'm going to try to summarize the situation. Minister Miller speaking. In the past 20 years, so much has happened since the Marshall decision, and the Indigenous fishing industry has grown since then. Now, there are issues. and some of that has resulted in the violence these past few weeks. But let's be very clear about the question that was asked. Indigenous fishing represents a tiny, tiny, minute portion of fishing in Canada. The fishing sector in Canada is very lucrative. Many people are making a lot of money. Let's be very clear. Indigenous communities have the right to fish. This right has not been regulated thus far, and there is some controversy about that. Indigenous peoples have the right to fish. Let's be clear on that. But also, it is a very small, small portion of the lobster industry.
I'd just like to say that we have an established table on rights recognition and self-determination with the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs. It is fishing is obviously a priority, but it is a matter of them understanding that there are some principles involved that Minister Jordan talks about. It's about conservation but using the science and making sure that they can exercise their rights in that sustainable way. And so we are, I think, optimistic about those conversations going forward. But as Minister Jordan explained, that the fish plans for each of the communities will be unique because of the reality of that fishery or that geography or that nation.
Thanks, Ian. Nous allons prendre une dernière
And now, one last question over the phone.
to you.
Thank you. We have no further questions registered at this time.
Parfait, merci.
Thank you. Our conference is now over.
Thank you. Merci. The conference has now ended.